Okay, live streaming. Are we on? We're on the air? Yeah, you're on air. Maybe Richard is watching from Tanzania.
That'd be great. That's a strange place to take a vacation.
I think his daughter wanted to visit Africa.
Say?
I think his daughter had an interest in
Ah,
time in Africa.
now he cares about his kids. All right. Glad to see he's maturing.
I remind you that he might be watching.
Do you want one? Can I just say
A few words.
a lot.
Can I say a few words?
He's a little bit nicer when he's sick. I gotta say that.
Who, Arthur?
Yeah, he's a little bit nicer when he's sick.
Plus
When
you
he's
put-
healthy, he's a little bit rude at times.
Plus, you put that nice plate of cake next to him. That's like really, that's abusement. That's you know, if this is not abusement, what is? I have a good Jewish lawyer if you want to sue Jay.
I have some people who break shirts.
We know about his people. We know about his people.
Yeah,
That's litigation.
you know, Arthur could push you in the street. You know that could be.
Suspicious. What did the guy say? Suspicious.
And it can have tremendous ramifications of being pushed in the street. So you better watch your mouth. So like we said earlier, we're going to speak about how did we get to Egypt? Why were we there? You know, it seems like this that needs to be understood of what is the reason. It turns out there was, like we said last week and the week before, it was a godly promise to Abraham that his descendants, his children, will be in Egypt. And how come Abraham did not resist as soon as he heard of it? How come he didn't oppose? How come he didn't try to save them like he saved everyone? And also, like we said earlier, about the concept of not living in Egypt permanently. So we'll try to touch upon it. First, the story with the this millionaire, billionaire. Millionaire is no longer rich. Nowadays, if you're a millionaire, you're average class, right? You reach your billionaire, right? So this billionaire was throwing this crazy party, and he had in his private pool, he put sharks. He put sharks into the pool, and he said, whoever swims the pool from side to side is going to get $1 million. Of course, nobody volunteered. What's $1 million? As we said, what's $1 million, right? Jay sees $1 million in the street, doesn't bend to pick it up, right? Million empty. So he says, whoever swims gets $1 million and gets my yacht, Again, nobody. And then he says, whoever swims from side to side gets this house, the mansion. It's not a regular house. It's a villa. It's a mansion. And, this is $10 million on the stake. This is serious stuff. And all of a sudden they see somebody swimming in the water. And everybody's looking at it, paying attention to the sharks. Anyways, he managed to get through the sharks and get to the other side. He gets to the other side, the rich man, this was a promise made in front of everyone. He says, okay, who do you want I should write the check to? So the guy says, I don't want the check. He says, okay, the yacht, can I write? No, the house, you want? He says, I don't want. He says, what do you want? He says, I want to know who's the bastard that pushed me into the water. That's what I'd like to know.
That's funny.
Really, the biggest surprise in life is life itself. Life is very surprising. You plan one thing and you end up doing a different thing. The world sometimes works in a very awkward way. All of a sudden you get stuck in an airport for 20 hours for missing a flight that you never thought you'll ever have to take, right? And you don't even know what connection it is. You're flying home. It takes literally the other side of the world. Getting stuck in an airport is not such a big deal for you. Huh? It's a part of the travel. Some people get married and they move to a different country. They following their spouse. Some people are offered a job. Yoram came to work here for some American fellow, and it's been 250 years, and he's still here. So, sometimes you're surprised. The biggest surprise in life is life itself, right? Sometimes you fall in the street. Some surprises are pleasant, some are less. And really, the biggest question we ask, what really brings us to where we were? Is it because we planned it, or because we didn't plan it, or we planned the other way around? Why do people end up being in places that either they didn't want to get there, or they didn't want to be there? Some people are in places they don't want to be in. So in fact, the Talmud says, we brought the same piece of Talmud last week. We spoke about knowing when Mashiach will come, when redemption will come, Jacob wanting to reveal to his children. So the Gemara says there's 7 things that is hidden from a person. Right? We had the same. I didn't have to work hard because I had the quote from last week. 7 things are concealed from man. 1 is the time of his death, the time of his contentment, the divine judgment, which is who is pious and who is wicked. We can only see someone's face, but we cannot know what's going on within them. And number 4, the thoughts of others. We cannot tell the thoughts. And number 5, the source of livelihood. A person does not know how will they have money. What will be? Will they open a shop, open a store? Will they be a physicist? Will they be something else? Right? The 6th thing is the time of the establishment of the King of David and the downfall of King of Rome, which is basically have to do with each other, the redemption. So the 5th thing, the Gemara says, clearly a person would never know. Somebody goes and starting from very young age, here we see it, Asians, Chinese, Taiwanese, from a very young age, they train their kids for excellence, and they want to get good scores and to get to the best schools, and they, who knows what they will do. They will be, it might be business people, might be something else. How many people are unemployed? They have a JD, a degree in law, and you don't know, they're doing something else completely. It's so common nowadays. Somebody studies something, majors in something, and end up working in something else. So the Gemara tells us it is indeed something that no one ever knows. And when we opened the book of Exodus last week, we concluded the book of Genesis, of Bereshit, and now we're opening the book of Exodus, as its name, Exodus in Latin, right? The Exodus of Egypt, and we want to know, why did our forefathers end up in Egypt? What made them go there to begin with? We know the famous story that there was no food, and Joseph was the king of Egypt, and they had to go and get food, and they brought Jacob, and everyone settled there. But what made them do all that journey? Why did God turn this whole thing into happening? And of course, this brings about the biggest question. We were talking last week about the fun time they had in Egypt, 17 years of happiness, of joy. Well, we're talking now of 86 years of pure suffering. When Pharaoh becomes sick, he's told that the best remedy for him is to slaughter Jewish babies and bathe in their blood. And we're talking about a time when the people had to build building, and if they didn't bring enough hay, enough straw, their actual bodies, their corpses will become a part of their building. So we're talking about serious stuff. And why is it so? So it's common to say, there's a famous saying in Hebrew, we say, "Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu," because of our sins, we were exiled from our country. But maybe this could come in terms with regards to the first temple destruction, the second temple destruction, the hatred amongst the Jews, and the inability to be joyful with each other, but always looking at the negative side. But we're talking about a generation that didn't have those things. They were just simple people, the sons of Jacob. Of course, as we learned while we covered the book of Genesis, they did make mistakes along the way. Everyone does make mistakes. It's not, no one is immune from that. But there's no sin that could have bring about those years of enslavement, of punishment. Why is it so? Why is it going on? And in fact, when coming to look at it, we can see how the book starts. The book starts, right? Why was it decreed to go to Egypt? We know it was a decree. We know Hashem decided that they will go to Egypt. This was already told to Abraham years and years ago. Hundreds of years before that, God told Abraham, "Yadoa teda ki ger yezaracha beretz lo lahem." You should know your descendants will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Va'avadum ve'inu otam, and they will enslave them and they will torture them. Ve'acharei ken yitzu beruchus gadol, and following that they would leave that land with great property. Ve'gam et hagoy asher ya'avodu dan anochi, and also that Gentile, that people that is abusing the Jews would come to retribution. Which of course, this is in Parashat Lech Lecha. Avraham Avinu. In Bereshit, in the beginning of Bereshit, chapter 15, Avraham Avinu is being told by God. God reveals himself to Abraham, and he does Brit Ben Avetarim, the covenant. If you remember, Abraham took 3 calf and 3 sheep, and he cut them, and he goes through, and this was a way of making a covenant, Brit. And then God told them, right, V'tatzipor batar, he didn't slice the bird, and God told them, you should know that your descendants will be enslaved in Egypt for many years. And coming to see the book of Exodus, here it starts. The book starts, Ve'el Shemot Bnei Israel, and these are the names. And look at what the verse says. Exodus 1:1, that's the beginning. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. And Orach Chaim HaKadosh Rabbi Chaim ben Attar, which is one of the interpreters of the Torah that has also touches of Kabbalah in his interpretation. And he says this following. The reason for the letter Vav, Ve'ele, and these are the names in this instance is to remind us that the years of exile of the Jewish people were computed as having already begun during the time of Abraham, not merely after the arrival of Jacob in Egypt. So he says everything was pre-planned. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't like this, it so happened that they got to Egypt. Still, another reason for the Torah writing the letter is to tell us that just as the earlier generation perceived that they were in exile and accepted their fate without resentment, so the generation of which we read here also accept their destiny without complaint. According to this, Torah informs us of the reason why the names appear once more. They had all willingly accepted their destiny to endure exile, as distinct from Esau, who had decided to leave the land of Canaan by moving to Mount Seir. When God told Abraham, God told him his descendants will be enslaved. So he had 2 children. He had Isaac, right, and Esau. Jacob and Esau, they were the children of Isaac, and they knew of it. So Jacob, what did he do? He voluntarily went to Egypt. Esau wanted to flee, wanted to run away. He didn't want to be involved in this. He didn't want to be under the decree. He's the descendants of Abraham, just like Jacob is. So he went to Mount Seir. And the Orach Chaim tells us, in fact, they knew that they had to be in Egypt, and they knew that this was a decree from above. And that's why the Torah is telling us this story. And usually when you start a new book, right, you close the book, you open a new book, is a new beginning. This appears to be a new beginning, but it starts with the word and, or in Hebrew, the letter ve. Ve'el Shemot, which means...
E-N-T or A-N-T?
If you look at the board, and. Yeah. Okay. So you can see that this starts, although it's a new beginning, but it starts with connecting this book to the previous book. So like we said earlier, when the Jews went to Egypt, everything was okay in the beginning, and everything seemed fine. And then Joseph died, his brothers died, Jacob died, all that generation died. We have a new generation, and also the king dies. There's 2 opinions in Rashi. Rashi brings from the Talmud what happened to the king. The first opinion is the king died, and there's a new king. And the second opinion is the same king, but he pretended like he's new. He didn't remember Joseph saving all the kingdom, saving all Egypt, saving the world. This was always for his credit, and the new king, or the seemingly new king, did not know of it. And then he realizes that there's Jews, and there's too many Jews. That's how he says, there's too many Jews. We know that from 1939. We had another fellow saying there's too many Jews. But this one is recorded in the very dawn of history. There's too many Jews. We have to get rid of them. We don't know who they're loyal to. I mean, here they're good citizens, but maybe they don't like the Egyptians. Maybe they will rebel against Egypt, against the king. We have to get rid of them. They're strangers, they're foreigners, they don't belong here. We have to get rid of them. And he starts persuading his people that this is what needs to be done. And in fact, this portion, the beginning of the book of Exodus, is very sad. Every verse gives us another story, another sad story of how the Jews are going from a very high standing to be servants and slaves, and to have their life not being meaningful in the eyes of their neighbors, the Egyptians. And here's what 3 decrees. That's what it says in Shemot Rabbah. It says, ruthlessly they made life bitter. So the Midrash says that all the 3 decrees are hinted in the 3 names of the heroes of the story. Miriam, Moshe, and Aaron. They were brothers. They were all children of Levi and Yocheved, right? And Amram and Yocheved. And it says Miriam. Miriam, what is Miriam? Ruthlessly, they made their life bitter. Miriam has the word bitterness, mar. In Hebrew, mar. Mar is bitter. And it says, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. This goes for Aaron. Aaron is similar for the word Erayon. Aaron, Erayon, pregnancy. Every boy that is born, you shall throw into the Nile. So this symbolizes, this goes for Moses. Because Moses, what is the name? Moshe. Ki min hamayim mishitu. Mishitu, I draw him from the water. That is the meaning of the name Moshe. Moshe means to pull out of the water. So Moses came out of the water. So these 3 decrees are actually destined. So what does Pharaoh start to think? There's too many Jews. What are we going to do? So first he says, let's enslave all the males, all the men. Right? Why? We'll enslave them. And they will lose any desire to live. If you have nothing to wake up in the morning for, and if you have nothing to expect to tomorrow, you know that yesterday you worked hard until you nearly died, and tomorrow you're going to work as hard and probably even harder. So you have no reason to live. You have no will. A person might lose their will of life. So Pharaoh said, first we'll take care of the men, and then they will stop reproducing. What is the reason to reproduce? You don't know the future of your children. Why have children? Right? Why would I bring a child to such an awful reality, to such a world? So he starts with the male, right? He does the enslavement to the male. And that's what calls for Miriam. Miriam is the word bitterness, bitter, right? And then once they stopped, it didn't work. They continued reproducing. So he went to the female, the midwives, right? The midwives that are in charge of the labor. And he says, you have to kill all the baby boys. And of course, they did not listen to him. They're Jewish themselves. They did not listen to him. He threatened to kill them, and they didn't listen to him. And then, after this doesn't help, Pharaoh decides that all the boys, not only the Jewish baby boys, all the baby boys, even the Egyptians, are being tossed into the river and drowned there. Because he doesn't know whether the Redeemer, Pharaoh believed a lot in astrology. And in those days, it actually was meaningful. There was power. Just like we say, we brought this several times, that when there were spiritual miracles, you could see a spirituality in this world. So in order to allow free choice, God gives the same ability to both sides, to both parties. So just like Kedusha, holiness has powers, also impurity has powers. There's also powers. What you read today in the newspaper is completely meaningless, right? But when Pharaoh spoke to the astrologers, they actually had an ability to understand things and to tell them and to prophesy. So they told him there's supposed to be a baby very time in the nearby future, and this baby will save the Jews and will devastate you and your kingdom. And we don't know whether this baby is Jewish or not Jewish. So Pharaoh says, all baby boys in the water, all baby boys are drowned. Of course, like we know the story, eventually he ended up raising the same boy as his grandson, right? Pharaoh's daughter went to bathe by the river. She saw Moses in the basket that his mother put him, and she saw him, and she said, it's a beautiful baby, and let me bring him and raise him. So he actually grew up as Pharaoh's grandson. Would you imagine? He drowned the whole kingdom, and eventually he's the one raising the boy that will eventually turn down and bring all that Pharaoh was afraid for on him. And indeed, really the question we have about how did God allow all this to happen? We know that there was a decree, and we know that they had to go to be in Egypt because God wants them to be in Egypt. But all these travesties, Jewish babies, slaughtering, and this enslavement, and why does God allow this to happen? And in fact, we find that Moses is asking the exact same question in the very end of our weekly portion. After Moses is being sent, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. God appoints Moses and he tells him you have to go to Egypt and take the Jews out. And he goes to Pharaoh. Hello, Grandpa. Yeah, you remember him as Grandpa, right? He goes to Pharaoh and he says, listen, God said you have to let the Jews go. Let my people go, right? The famous quote. And Pharaoh says to him, Mi Hashem asher eshmai kolo. Who is this God of yours that I will adhere to him? I am God, Pharaoh says to Moses. I am the God here. And he says, who is this? What are you talking about? Who is this God? He says, Lo yadati et Hashem ve'et Yisrael lo asholech. I don't know about this God, and the Jews are not going anywhere. They're staying here. And then as a result of this very serious conversation, Pharaoh actually makes life more miserable and worse for the Jews. Until now, they used to give them raw material and they would make the bricks, the stones. And now, no more raw material, and they have to have the same capacity. They have to have the same every day to do the same like they did before. So all the people are coming to Moses, says, look what you've done. You went to speak to Pharaoh, now it's becoming unbearable. Until now, we could have at least managed somehow, but now. So Moses takes that question and turns to God and says, Lama hareota lama ze, why did you cause harm to these people? Look, the cry of Moses, why did you harm them? This is what Exodus, in the end of our portion, then Moses turned to God and said, oh Lord, why did you bring harm upon these people? Why did you send me? Look what happens. I went to speak to Pharaoh and things are becoming worse. And look at what the Midrash says. Moses says to God, I went through the book of Genesis and I looked at the actions of the generations of the flood and how they were punished. The generations of Babylon Tower and how were they punished. The sins of the people in Sodom and Gomorrah and their punishment. But this nation, what have they done that they are enslaved in Egypt now? Perhaps you want to say it was Abraham who didn't believe, because God told Abraham, don't worry, your descendants. And Abraham says, how will I know that what you're telling me is true? Now that's very rude, so to speak, like that to speak to God. God tells you something and a person tells, how would I know it's true? If I tell you something, you could say, how would I know it's true? But if God speaks to Abraham and we're talking about a level that they could communicate with each other in a certain way, so he says, how would I know it's true? And in fact, that's something that triggered a little bit of, I wouldn't say anger, but not so much pleasure. So Abraham deserved punishment for saying that. So he said that if you want to say it was Abraham who didn't believe, let him and his generation be punished. Why my generation? So Moses says, I'm looking at the world. Okay, people are doing good things and people are doing bad things. And people are doing good things, they get rewarded. And those who are doing bad things are punished. But what about these people? What do you want from this nation? Where could they go wrong? What do you want from them? Why are we here? Why are they enslaved? And in fact, this is the most serious argument that anyone ever raised to God. Telling God, why is this happening? And we'll see in the beginning of next week's portion, God tells him, you should know, I was visioned to the forefathers and no one ever questioned my behavior. You should know that everything has a reason and everything has a plan. They have to be enslaved and then they'll go out. It's all a part of the big deal. And God actually came down to Moses and explained to him something that a normal person is very hard to perceive. The ways of God, as we know, the ways of God are hidden. But at the end of the day, right, we know that Abraham was already introduced with that. And the question we have about Abraham is, why is it that Abraham not resenting, not trying to say, why is it going to happen? God tells him, I want you to know your descendants will go to Egypt and they will be tortured. And why doesn't he say, hold it, hold it, hold it? Why is it going to happen? It turns out Abraham understood something, and that's why he didn't ask his question. What did he understand? That's what we're trying to get today. Anyway, before we get further to this, we're going to touch upon what we said earlier when I sent a message about the class, which is about Egypt. We know that we were in Egypt, and we know that we're not supposed to go back to Egypt. This is what the verse says in Exodus. For the way you have seen Egypt is only today, but you shall no longer continue to see it for eternity. When the Jews left Egypt and things were going a little off the track, they were going in the desert, and then they got to the sea, to the ocean, the Red Sea. Okay, now what? Smarty pants, where are you going now? Okay, Pharaoh is behind us, and the water is in front of us. What are we doing? So some people said, let's go back to Egypt. We'll say sorry. We'll pretend like nothing had happened. We'll continue working hard. Where do you want these bricks? We'll put them here, right? So, of course, Moses tells them, you have seen Egypt, you will never see Egypt again. You're not going back to Egypt. And from this, what Maimonides learns in Laws of Kings, chapter 5, it is permitted to dwell anywhere in the entire world, including Taiwan, with the exception of the land of Egypt. Its territory includes a square of 400 parsah by 400 parsah. Parsah is a measurement of land. from the Mediterranean Sea proceeding westward, bordering on the land of Cush and the desert. It is forbidden to dwell in this entire territory. This is what Maimonides brings. Lehalacha lemaaseh, as practical law, one is not supposed to live in Egypt. By the way, Rambam Maimonides, where did he live?
Egypt.
In Egypt. Okay, very interesting, huh? So that's what the Radbaz says, right? Rabbi David Ben Zimra. The Midrash actually brings that whenever Jews try to settle in Egypt for a long term, it was always something went wrong. We know in the time of Alexander the Great, there was the Midrash says that the Talmud brings it that whoever didn't see a synagogue, the great synagogue of Alexandria, this is a replica of the great synagogue. It's still there, but it's not as nice as it used to be. Didn't see a synagogue in his life. They said that they built it in such a manner that it was so big, it has thousands of people praying at the same time. And of course, this was prior to microphone era. So the chazan, the cantor, was to stand in the front of the shul and saying the prayer, right? And then nobody, you could hear him, 100 people, 200 people, but what about all the rest? So they actually had people like they had raising like flags or doing some gestures. Amen. To say amen, to know when the Kaddish is, not like here when we have 10 people and I have to beg everyone to say amen. Where's Richard to respond amen? That always does it. So this was the great community. The great community in Alexandria in Egypt, and what ended up happening, the king of Rome came and of course killed a lot of people and eventually completely got rid of the Jews that were there. So every time when the Jews tried to settle in Egypt, it didn't work well. By the way, Maimonides passed away on the 20th of Tevet, which is actually on Friday. Friday is his passing day, so you to remember. So this is what the Radbaz writes. He was also a rabbi in Egypt. And he says, okay, we're in Egypt now, but he says what the Torah bans is only settling in Egypt, but not visiting or even residing there. Moreover, even us, while living in Egypt, he writes his interpretation like Maimonides in Egypt, are still yearning to get to the promised land and will do so as soon as it will be feasible. Yeah, we live in Egypt. Yeah, we were born in Egypt. Our grandchildren were born in Egypt, maybe their grandchildren. It wasn't the case. Eventually they all left. But this is not home. This would never be home. As soon as they let us go to our land, to our homeland, we will get there at no time. So that means we're not really settling here. We're not really, we're residing here, we're visiting here. Maybe it's a long visit, but this is not called settling. And indeed, we have, the question is why is it so? Why is Egypt a place that you're not supposed to live in? Okay, we said there's a verse, and we said Maimonides brings it. And if you look at Deuteronomy, it brings a verse about converts from Egypt or from other places. He says, "You shall not despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. Edom is Esav, the brother of Jacob. You shall not despise an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land." He says, say whatever you want, but you lived in Egypt for 400, 200, whatever the math is, years, and you were hosted. It wasn't such a great hosting. They killed us, but we were still there. So we should have a little bit of respect towards the Egyptians. So why is it so? Let me tell you a story about, we call these people tax collector. Some people go to collect charity in Jewish communities around the world. So this guy from Jerusalem, and he's going to Italy. He's going to Italy. This is a story years ago. He goes to Italy and he's going to collect funds for an institution. I don't know, it was a hospital or orphanage or soup kitchen, whatever it was. And he goes to Milan and they tell him about this rich Jew. And he approaches, he gets to the house, and indeed it's a beautiful house. And, chandeliers are on the ceiling and carpets from Persia and beautiful portraits. Obviously the guy knows a thing or two about art. And suddenly he notices something weird. There's a golden menorah for Hanukkah that's in the cabinet. And next to the golden menorah, there's a broken glass bottle. Broken, just a simple glass bottle. Nowadays they don't make glass bottles anymore. or they do. For beer, they still do glass bottles, yeah. But it used to be, right, milk was in glass bottles, everything was in glass bottles, right? So broken glass bottles, and he turns to his host, of course, after talking, and he says, I got to ask you a question. It's a beautiful house. Everything is right on the spot, but what is this broken glass bottle? So he says, I'll tell you the story. He says, I was born in Holland, in Netherlands. Nice, huh? And he says, I was born to an Orthodox Jewish family. And one day, my grandfather sends a letter from Italy. His grandfather lived in Italy. And he says that he has a lot of businesses, but he's already old. And he doesn't feel so well nowadays, and he needs someone to help him run his business. He wants someone he could trust. And my grandfather, although living in Italy, we were Holland, he was supporting us. He was supporting my parents. He was supporting me. And my parents thought it would be a good opportunity. I'll go study business. I'll be with my grandfather. I'll help him. And maybe one day I'll also be running this business. And I went there, and I went to work with my grandfather. The work was very demanding. My grandfather had quite a big portfolio of business, between real estate to factories to manufacturing. And he says, I used to be an Orthodox Jew. It's very strict. But one day I was so tied up with a meeting, I forgot to pray mincha. And he says, another day I didn't have time to put tefillin because I wake up in the morning very early and I have to rush to the train to get to another meeting. And I slowly left the religion. Not out of being anti, but just, having excuses. And I gradually got away from the Jewish community, from my background. And of course, when this was time already to get married, I was already not practicing at all. And I found I was already rich. My grandfather passed, and now I became the manager of this business. And I, of course, not married just a simple Jewish girl. He needed someone from an aristocratic family. So I chose someone that's, although she's Jewish, but she's completely non-observant. He still kept the Jewish tradition, but completely non-observant. And he says one day, this guy from Italy tells our friend from Jerusalem, he says, I was walking back from the office, and I see a group of children, and in the middle there was another child that was crying. And he says, he approaches this child and he says, what happened? So the child says, what am I going to tell my father? What will I tell my father? What will I tell Papa? And he says, what do you mean? What happened? And he says, tonight is the first night of Hanukkah. And my father sent me to the store to buy olive oil to light the menorah, to light the Hanukkah. And I went quickly because it's already evening and we have to start. And I tripped. And the bottle fell and broke and all the oil spilled. Now, this is not a rich family. Getting a bottle of olive oil is a serious thing. And he says, what will I tell my father? He couldn't get over it. He says, what will I tell my father? What will I tell my father? Of course, I took out my wallet. He said I gave him enough money to buy several bottles of oil. And I went back home. And I thought I did a good deed. I helped a child. I got him whatever. And I thought a good deed. But the cry of that child was in my head. And the words that he used were actually in my head. What will I tell my father? What will I tell my father? And I started realizing, look at me. I come from a Jewish family. And tonight is Hanukkah. I didn't even know of the Jewish calendar. I didn't know my Hanukkah. And I'm thinking, I have a family and I have children. And what will I tell my father? He says, you can hear the words resonate. What will I tell my father? What will I tell? And he thinks, what will I tell my father? Thinking of my father in heaven. What will I tell my father? They sent me here to do business, to help the family, to support. And look what happened with me. What will I tell my father? So he went back to the street and he got that broken bottle of oil. And he framed it and he put it in his house. And on that day, he changed his ways. And he went back to Judaism. All because these words of a simple child crying, what will I tell my father? And indeed, this really, the Torah trying to explain to us the suffering of Egypt. The suffering that happened in Egypt is like a furnace, right? And God, here, this is a verse from Deuteronomy. And God took and brought out of Egypt that iron blast furnace to be his very own people, as is now the case. כור, אתה מכיר? כור ההיתוך. ואתכם לקח השם מכור הברזל, from the iron furnace. What does iron furnace have to do? So this is what the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah. An iron furnace separates all the waste and forms pure silver and gold. So was Egypt, which refined the Jews through the hardships of slavery and helped separate good from bad. What was Egypt all about? Egypt was like a big oven, a furnace. And in the oven, if you want to create, every new formation starts in the furnace. You want to start something new, you have to start with tremendous amount of heat. And you have to start in the oven. Mitzrayim, Egypt, was the place where the Jews were created, were crafted. You know, the Jewish nation was introduced later when God came down on Mount Sinai, giving us the 10 Commandments, giving us the Torah. And God said, you will be my nation, my people. But how did it all start? We said it last week. The book of Exodus doesn't begin with the redemption. It begins with the enslavement. Why? Because it has to start there. You cannot skip that stage. You cannot give up that stage of being together and being in a state of hardship, because that's what forms. That's the ability to form a nation, to form a people. And indeed, any process of creation, also with nature, when you plant a seed. What happens to the seed? It gets rotten. Once it gets rotten, right, it's absorbed in the soil, and then eventually you can have sprouting, right? You can have the little, what is it called? A plant coming out of that seed, but it has to get rotten first. It has to be bad. It has to deprive. It has to not deprive. What am I? Decay. What is it? Decay. Yeah, going right. And we know it with regards to getting a new job, with getting a new relationship. It's always the beginning of the relationship, the beginning of the work. That's the hardest thing, right? If you survive the first 2 months, the first 2 weeks, the first 2 years sometimes, that's a little longer, then you're on the horse. You got it through. You're on the right spot. But every beginning has to start with hardship. Every beginning has to be like that. If it's too easy, it's not serious, right? Easy come, easy go. Somebody promises you things and sure, you'll get it, this, that. Come work with me and everything will be okay. I'll pay you great and you have a great tours. You come when you go, come when you want, leave when you want, do what you want. That doesn't sound.
But that's the same in relationships, right?
What is it?
When somebody meets their future wife, it doesn't have to be that way, right?
It doesn't have to be what?
With that hardship at the beginning.
Well, the hardships are always formed. If not in the very beginning, once they decide to make that connection, to make that bond and commit to each other, yes, of course, hardship arouses. It's a part of the process. You cannot be. If there's no hardships, you have to question something is wrong with this. If it's too easy, then it's not, because taking two people and connecting into one entity, into one reality, is a serious process. And that's what happened in Egypt. That's a furnace. That's an oven. Egypt, the hardships. So the destination was, of course, getting the Torah, being the Jewish people, but it had to go through. The path was through Egypt. The path was rebirth of the Jewish people. And that brings us a little bit about the suffering. We asked, what is the suffering all about? So the suffering it's inevitable. It's a part of the process. It has to be in a certain way. But let's just look at, what does this have to do with us? Okay, we could tell our forefathers, why did this happen to them? Why? What about us? We started the class today with saying that we make plans and everything changes, and we think we know what we're doing, but we don't really know what we're doing, and we commit to something and we end up doing something else. Why is it so? This is exile. Why is this exile? So this story happened 150 years ago in Russia. It was a Hasidic Jew, and he lived in a city called Polacek or whatever. I don't know exactly how it's expressed. This was a big city in Russia, in White Russia actually, and it was filled with synagogues and yeshivas, and everything was okay. And our friend was I forgot the word. The guy goldsmith. Yeah, like Sid Goldsmith. He was a goldsmith. So of course he had a good reputation, a good job. He had a little store in the city center, and everyone used to come to him and he used to make for them whatever they needed, the gold, silver. His life were happy, and he had money and he had happiness. Everything was okay. days go by, and there's new people in town. You know, a new guy opens another goldsmith, and another one opened there, and they're taking lower prices, and they're giving better services. When you're the only one in town, you could tell someone, I don't have time, come in 2 weeks. But when there's competition, you know better. When there's competition, you have to be there first and give the best prices and discounts and promotions and luring everyone to come to you. And our friend was from the older generation, and he didn't know these tricks. And slowly, his livelihood started to become less and less. And he didn't have any choice. He had to close down his store and actually try to find something to do. So somebody tipped him that there's a far city in Russia called Vladimir. You know, the president of Russia, Vladimir. There's a city in Russia, Vladimir. I didn't know that, but I learned it. And they told him, maybe there, you'll be lucky. There's no one there. You know, there's some people there, but obviously no one is involved with goldsmith, someone who came from that city. And he said, okay, I'll move there, take his family. And he decided he wants to go there, but he realized that this city had no Jewish infrastructure. There was no synagogues, and there was no yeshivot, there was no minyan in the morning, minyan in the evening. There was a few Jews there, but there's no Jewish infrastructure. And he, although finding a source of livelihood, like we said, nobody knows what will be their source of livelihood, but he felt very sad that he had to disconnect from the community life and being all alone as a Jew. So he decided he goes to the Rebbe Maharash, was the 5th Rebbe of Chabad, and he's asking him, and he says to him, God wants me to be loyal to Torah, to be observant, to be religious, but on the other hand, I don't have any livelihood, I don't have any money. I have to go following the path of livelihood. I have to go find. And he says, why does God take me to that place that has no Torah law, no Torah Jews, and no Jewish life, no Jewish infrastructure? So the Rebbe looks at him and he says, let me ask you a serious question. I want to ask you a serious question. He says, do you think that in order to provide you money, God has to send you from one city to a city that's in the other side of the country? You think God is limited? He cannot provide you money or livelihood unless you go somewhere else? You think, there He can give you money and here He cannot give you money? Do you really think God is so limited that He's, only there I can give you livelihood? Of course not. But what? There's a reason why you're going to that city. And the Rebbe tells him, he says, in that city, there was a big community of Cantonistim. Cantonistim were, during the time of the Tsar, used to take children at a very young age. This was, by the way, one of the biggest success of the army, right? The army in those days, the army of the Tsar, was that people were trained from a very, very young age. They were trained to be like animals. They were taken away from their natural habitat, and they were put in special camps, and they had to learn to survive. And the strong survived, and those who survived were like animals. When they got to battle, nothing could stop them. And that's why they could conquer, that's why they got a lot of success during the time of the Tsar. So unfortunately, there were Jewish children also that were taken to the army. You know how old they were? 8 years old. They were taken to this program of the army. And of course, a lot perished, a lot didn't survive, but a lot did survive. And this city had a community of veterans, of army people that used to be in the service, right? Active service. But now they're older already, or some of them are wounded. And he says many of them are Jewish people. Many of them are those Cantonists, many of them are Jewish. And he says they live in this city. And all these years they're waiting for someone to come to the city and help them build Jewish life. So he says, you think God sends you because He can't give you business to do goldsmith in this city? He's sending you to the other place because there's a reason you have to get there. You are not the topic here. You're not the subject. The subject are these people that need your help. And God actually made, other people open shops, and you have to get to the other place because you need to be there and help those Jews. Learn them, teach them, learn with them, be with them, guide them, open a synagogue, be a community for them. That's why you're going, not in order to get a few bucks. And indeed, this individual took that task, and he did tremendously well with this group, the Cantonistim, and many of them actually continue their life as observant Jews with everything. So the Rebbe brings a vort from in the name of the Rebbe Ayatz, and he says as following, right? In a land that's not theirs, he says a person is sometimes sent to a place that is not his, meaning not for his benefit, but for the place's benefit. And what does he mean? He says it from here. This is the Rebbe brings from. There's a beautiful voice. She'll probably in the opera someday. The Rebbe says like this. How could Abraham, we asked that question. Here's the question I asked it before. How could Abraham come to terms with the decree, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them. Remember, when God tells Abraham, I will turn Sodom and Gomorrah, I'll turn it. He starts, hey, hold it. No, what if there's righteous people there? What about if there's, right? Maybe there's 50 righteous, maybe 45, maybe 40, 30, right? He goes through the whole list until God says there's not even one. There's not even one that's worth that I'll keep that place alive, right? You know the story, Arthur, of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That place where wicked people lived. So, Abraham likes to argue with God, turns out. He was Jewish. After all, he was Jewish. And then when God says, I want you to know your descendants will be enslaved, and Abraham says, okay. What do you mean, okay? Why don't you resist? So this is what the verse says. You should know there will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. How could he not try to protect them or save them from it? The answer is hinted in the words, in a land that is not theirs. This is not for them, the Jews, but rather it is to refine and elevate the sparks of godliness that are in Egypt. Now this is a little bit of a deep idea that's brought down in Kabbalah. We know that God, when creating the world, there was a process in the worlds, in the realms above. Prior to creating the world, God is here and nothing else but God is here. In fact, also after creating the world, God is the only reality. That's what we say in Shema Yisrael every day. We say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It's called Yichud Hashem, the oneness of godliness, the notion that God is the only creation, the only entity, the only thing that ever existed and the only thing that will ever exist. So before creating the world was not able to receive the light of God because the light is too strong, right? If you take Albert Einstein and you put him in a second grade children and they want to study math, and he starts drawing formulas on the board, right? He's trying and start telling them all kinds of quantum mechanics or very complicated physics. They don't know what he's talking about. He's not teaching. He might be saying that he knows it, but they're not studying. This is not teaching. Or let's say you're in a room that's dark, and then there's a sunny day outside. You're in a dark room, and you want to get some light. You open the blind, and then the sun goes in, and it blinds you at the very, very first moment. You wanted some light, but there's too much light. When there's too much light, you can't see anything. Right? If somebody stands in front of the sun, and the sun is on their face, they're trying to look at the sun, you'd say, what can't you see? It's the most illuminated thing. There's so much light. There's too much light. Sometimes too much light is like darkness. It blinds you. You can't get a hold. So God, creating the world, had to conceal his light, had to take some of his light, some of his presence, and put it aside in order for the world to create, in order for the world to exist. Otherwise, it was too much light. Nobody could have been created. Nobody could have sustained that. So there was a process that's called Shvirat HaKelim. Literally means the breaking of the vessels, this is, of course, just to try to depict to us what happened in the worlds above. So we have vessels and we have light, and the light was too strong, it was too eminent, and the vessels broke. The vessels broke, and there's sparks everywhere. Those sparks of godliness actually are in this world, and we have to gather those sparks. How do we gather sparks of godliness? It's not like the people here go with their, what is it called, the Pokemon? What is it that they go around in the street? What's that game, right? What is it called? Yeah? Pokemon, right? Pokemon. Yeah, they go in the street, so that's not what God wants from us. Refining the world, gathering those sparks, is actually being active in the world, taking physical things and elevating them, doing mitzvahs, doing good deeds, helping, taking physical means and utilizing it for holiness, utilizing it for purposes of goodness and kindness. That's elevating the world. So in fact, the Jews had to go to Egypt because Egypt was a very bad place. And actually, in the worst places, there's the biggest sparks, the most sparks. And by staying in Egypt, it says there were 288 sparks, and out of which 202 were gathered in Egypt. It means the vast majority of everything that happened in the worlds above took place of what the Jews did in Egypt, being in Egypt and gathering those sparks. So being in Egypt actually is not for them. It's for God. It's for the purpose that they were there. And this what we explain, I will get to that when we get there because I want to teach that. What we explain about the Jews before leaving Egypt, they had to borrow all the gold and silver from the Egyptians. You know that they had to borrow. They had to say, give me, because in a time of darkness, do you remember there was a plague of darkness? And the darkness, the Egyptians not only could not see, they could also not move. They were stuck in the same position for 3 days. While they were stuck, the Jews actually lived normally. So they walked into their houses and they saw everything. They went peeking a little bit, finding other stuff. So then, after the days of darkness, Moses comes with a new command from God, and he says, I want you to tell everyone to borrow from the Egyptians silver and gold. And they went to the Egyptian, and he said, could you borrow me, a plate of silver, a goblet? I don't have any. Oh, you don't have any. In the cabinet, on the third door, on the drawer, behind the plant, there's something there. They knew exactly where it was. So they had to take. Why did they have to take? This is kind of anti-Semitic. This Jews with the long nose was always after the money, right? That's very anti-Semitic. But that was the case. They went and they borrowed. They never bothered to return it. So they borrowed. Why is it so? Because of the sparks of godliness. Those things are later to be built. The temple, the tabernacle was built from that gold and silver. By the way, just to close the story, I don't want to leave it as a question. I want to tell you that during the time of, it was Alexander the Great? It was another king, I forgot. That they said, Alexander the Great, he was a king in Egypt. So they said, your forefathers borrowed all these vessels, all these things of gold and silver. They never returned it. You have to give us back. So the sages were very puzzled. What are we to answer? So they found this guy. His name was Gvia ben Psisa. And he wasn't perceived as a very smart man. He was kind of a nice fellow, easygoing. And he said, I'll go argue with the king. They said, what do you mean you'll go? Who are you? And he said, exactly, that's what, I'll go. If I'll succeed, then it'll be great. If I won't succeed, then you say, who sent that idiot? He just went on his own. We don't know this guy. So he said, you have something good to say? He said, yes, I have something great to say. So he went, and Alexander the Great, the king of Egypt, was the biggest empire in those days, comes and says, we'll open the Torah, and we'll see that Moses telling the Jews to borrow from the Egyptians all these things of gold and silver, and he doesn't say anywhere they returned it. They actually never returned. So Gvia ben Psisa, you know the story. Gvia ben Psisa tells the king, okay, what is your source? Your source is the Torah. Let us look a few more verses into the Torah. It says that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. So they didn't have calculators in those days. They had a cheshbonia, what's it called? He says, how much is minimum wage nowadays in Egypt? Minimum wage, right? And then he says, we had 600,000 men working at every given moment. And why don't we double 600,000 in 430 years for a minimum pay? And you'll find out that we actually didn't take enough. We actually had to take even more than what we take. There's not money in you owe us money over all the enslavement, and they let him go. That was by the way, just to close the story. Anyway, so what happened is the Jews leaving Egypt, taking with them all that silver and gold, because that's a way of refining. They're taking things that were used by the Egyptians, not necessarily for positive deeds, and they're actually turning it into a tabernacle, into a temple for God. And really this brings about, we know about the Jewish people as the wandering Jew. We know this term. The Jewish people are always wandering. Chinese people live in China, and French people live in France, and everyone lives in their country. But Jews, you can ask where the Jews, they're all over the place. Even Israel, as big as it may be, there's still more Jews outside of Israel than in Israel. So no one could argue that, Israel, of course, is a Jewish country, a Jewish state, but there's still more Jews outside of Israel than in Israel. And when coming to look at that outside of Israel, obviously there's many cities in the world that there's a lot of Jews, including this city, not that many, but there's still Jews are all everywhere. And why is it so? We're really hard to stay in one place. We love to stay in one place, but we have missions we have to do. We have to be involved in the world because there's so many things to achieve, so many things to do, and we need to redeem those sparks of godliness. And that's what the Talmud says, quote from the Talmud from Tractate Pesachim. Rabbi Elazar said, the Holy One, blessed be, exiled Israel among the nations, only so that the converts would join them. As it is stated, and I will sow her to me in the land. Uzratia ba'aretz. Does a person sow a se'ah of grain for any reason other than to bring a several core of grain during the harvest? If you take one seed and plant it in the ground, what do you say? I hope I'm going to get the seed back. Do you go about making a business? You put $500,000 and you get inventory and you said, I hope I'm going to sell it for $500,000. That's not what you do business for. Why would you bother, right? So if somebody plants a seed, it's in order for a tree to come out of it, containing many fruits and many seeds. So if God puts Jews all over the world, it's to gain something. What is it to gain? So the Talmud says it is so to the exile enable converts from the nations to join Jewish people. And the Rebbe explains, of course, we see there aren't too many converts to Jewish people. We don't do it as a mass conversion. We don't believe in that. We try to not encourage people to convert. So what does it mean? So the Rebbe explains not only converts, but even when using this world and utilizing all that is in it for holiness. So this is the reason why a person is wherever he or she is. So in other words, being in a certain place, I think it's because of this reason or that reason. In fact, it's because to actually affect and influence the world and elevate what I could elevate, take what I could take and use it for good purposes, use it for good deeds. So this is the reason why we said, why is no one supposed to live in Egypt? Because Egypt is already gone. No more Egypt. That's what the Arizal brings. The Torah says, you will no longer see them. Why was this only referring to Egypt, not to other exiles? Indeed, it is since in all exiles, the Jews needed to redeem the sparks of holiness that were hidden in those places. Since Egypt was completely emptied out of holiness, there's no reason for the Jews to go there ever again. Which means, whenever we go somewhere, it's because there's a holy reason why we're there. And if there's no reason to get there, then we don't get there. So in other words, the ban, the prohibition, is not you're not supposed to go there. It's you don't have what to do there. There's no reason for you to be there because this was already taken. Everything that could have been taken from Egypt was already taken. There's no reason for you to be there. And indeed, I brought another thing. I don't know if we had enough time. This is what Mordechai tells Esther. It's a piece of Purim. I'll teach it in Purim as well. But Mordechai tells Esther in the story of Purim, he says, for it, if you remain silent at this time, relief and rescue will arise for the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether for a time like this you have attained kingdom. So Mordechai says, right, first he threatens her. The story is, you know the story of Purim, right? This Esther, Haman comes and says, we'll call all the Jews. And Mordechai says, Esther, she's his niece, you're the queen. This is the time you go to the king and you tell the king not to kill the Jews. And Esther says, you think it's so simple? You can't go into the king whenever you want. If you go into the king without getting called, story's over, you know. He's a dictator. He's a classic, par excellence dictator. The head is being disconnected from the body in no time. And he says, you have to go. And he says, if you don't go, then, he says, if you remain silent, and he says, who knows whether for a time like this you have attained kingdom. Why is he threatening her, right? He says, and why is he saying, who knows, right? He could say, I say that this is the time why you're the queen in order to save the Jews. And the Rebbe in 1962 brought this, and he says, Mordechai says, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. Nobody knows why someone is in a position they could help. It is not, we cannot tell why is it so. I could only guess, I could only think that you were here for a reason, and you have that ability for a reason, and you have to, if you have the opportunity, you should take it in both hands and implement it and try to do something about it. Anyway, there's a little more, but it's already late. So, and to answer the question, the Jews were in Egypt not because they deserved to be in Egypt, but because they were needed. God needed us in Egypt. And Abraham didn't resist because he understood that And we're not supposed to go live in Egypt any longer because there's no reason for us to be there. The only place we're at is because we have a spiritual mission. So we're here in Taipei. I guess that's what for us to achieve in Taipei. So, this is something we have to take as homework and find out what is the reason why we're here. But if we are here, that's a sign we need to be here. And if we're already here, we might as well do something about it. That's it for today. Any questions?